I graduated from Baruch as valedictorian. And that was most likely the only time that a Russian agent gave the valedictory at an American business school.
Business school, talking about the virtues of capitalism. My guest today is former Soviet KGB agent Jack Barsky. Jack Barsky was born Albert Dietrich in 1949 in East Germany. When he was a senior studying chemistry at a university in East Germany, he was approached by someone from the East German Secret Police, Stasi, and offered a job. He accepted and was then sent for training with the KGB. In 1978, when he was 29 years old, he was sent to the United States as a sleeper agent and given the alias Jack Philip Barsky. His mission was to get a U.S. passport, insert himself into American society, and to make contacts with foreign policy think tanks and get close to President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in order to influence policy. Boy, the KGB, they thought big. After close to 20 years undercover, the FBI finally caught up with him. Since his capture, the FBI found him to be a tremendous source of information about KGB spy techniques, and he has worked with both the FBI and NSA. In 2014, Jack became a U.S. citizen. Today, he is a law-abiding, patriotic American living a normal life with his wife and family. I recently sat down with Jack to talk about how he led a double life and why he decided to defect to the United States and become a citizen. Jack, thanks so much for being on the show. I greatly appreciate it.
It is my pleasure, sir.
You know, Jack, over the last several days, I read your book, Deep Undercover, My Secret Life and Tangled Allegiances as a KGB Spy in America. And I want to tell you, pal, it sounds like I was reading fiction. Now, this is your life. It totally is just absolutely amazing. So before we begin with anything, how do I know I'm speaking to Jack Barsky today?
No, you're not. Well, you are speaking to the documented Jack Barsky. That is indeed correct. But if you're referring to how do you know that this isn't mostly fiction? Well, I got some really, really good support from people that know my story from the other side. There's people that are still alive that knew me way back when I was in Germany, and most importantly, the FBI that did a very thorough investigation. And whatever I put in there, to the extent it can be verified, is verified. The rest of it, you just got to believe.
All right.
But you know, I got to tell you, at this point, it makes no sense for me to lie anymore. You know, because I started out as a child, as a young person, I was always called brutally honest, and then I had to live that grand old lie. Eventually, I'm so much more comfortable with myself now that I can really tell the truth.
Okay, so now, just so we back up here, because I want to tell you, I read this book, and I'm reading through this, and I'm saying, I just can't believe it, because it takes place in New York City. It takes place at Baruch College, which is a stone's throw from my house. In fact, we were talking before the show that several of my friends were probably passing you in the hallways at Baruch College in the early 1980s, and that's how you got in there. So let's start from the beginning. You were born in what was then East Germany, right after the partition, after World War II. And
yes, which at the time was not yet a state. It became a state, the German Democratic Republic, 6 months after I was born.
Got it. So
it was the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany.
So you grew up there. Your parents, I'm assuming, are German. Where were they from? Your parents?
Well, my parents were both from the eastern part of Germany, pretty far east, and it turns out that I'm really genetically only half German. The other half is divided into Czech and Polish, because this is the area where I grew up, where my parents grew up, where those genes mingled and intermixed quite a bit. So
you're growing up in post-World War II Germany, which especially in you were in the Soviet territory, occupied territory, was pretty terrible. I think you wrote in the book that your parents had an average caloric intake of around 1,500 calories a day.
That was the average across the country, and it was skewed in terms of it hit the big city dwellers much harder than the folks that lived in the country. We had always enough to eat, but not always nutritious food. Our staple was potatoes, and you live in the country, you'll find a farmer who has enough potatoes. You can either buy them or trade. But I grew up very thin. I have a picture of me when I was about 11 years old, and it looks horrible. I'm like so thin, and I wanted to play sports, but my heart wasn't developed, so I wasn't even allowed to play sports. It eased over time, but the first 10 years, I can't remember ever having been hungry, but I also cannot remember some really good food that I got in those days.
So it's pretty amazing to me that in today's environment we have in America, we have so many people who are calling for socialism and a utopia that they have no idea about, where they can go to McDonald's or Burger King and consume 1,500 calories at one sitting and still be hungry. And here you are in a whole entire country, or really a zone, which later became a country, we're not even eating 1,500 calories a day. So where is this?
Yeah, let me expand on this a little bit. As time went on, and I was in my 20s, at that time, food was readily available. But every time I go into a supermarket in the United States, I still marvel at what the variety and the amount of food available in this country, even when it was quote unquote good in the Soviet Union or in East Germany, you got like one of something, or very often you had to buy what they had, not what you wanted.
Yeah, 100%.
It's a huge difference.
100%. So you grew up in what later became East Germany. You were a smart kid. You went to university. You were studying chemistry. And then what happens that changes your life?
Well, I studied chemistry. I finished my degree. I have a master's degree, the equivalent of a master's degree in chemistry. And I became an employee of the university as a assistant professor, taught a little math, taught a little chemistry. But in my third year in college, I was approached by the KGB. And I had a relationship with my handler. There was one person with whom I met on a regular basis. And it was pretty clear what they wanted me to do, but it took a long time getting to know each other.
Well, how does that work, Jack? I'm real sorry. I don't know the spy game. I'm sitting in class one day. I'm teaching math or chemistry. Does someone come up to you and say, "Hi, I'm from the KGB," and shows your KGB card and says, "We'd like you to work for us"? How does this work in the spy world?
No, see, when somebody from an intelligence agency comes and introduces themselves, most likely they'll give you a cover name. They won't give you the real name. They won't show you ID at all. So I was initially approached by a German national. The fellow spoke a very good German, just accent-free German. He was most likely a collaborator, one of those unofficial folks that work with the KGB in our country, and he introduced himself one day. He came to visit me at the dorm where I stayed, and I was on a Saturday. I was alone in my room, and he introduced himself initially as a representative of a local optical company. Stating that he wanted to just chat with me about my future after graduation, which was a most idiotic cover story. I knew immediately that he wasn't telling me the truth, because in East Germany, companies did not recruit. You were assigned places. So I don't know what this guy was like, unlikable and incapable. But, I knew what he was after, and so I played along. And it came to a point where he changed his story, and he said, "Yeah, I gotta come clean with you. I'm not really from that company. I work for the government." And then he asked the question that he wanted to have. That's the only question he came to see me for. And the question, I can remember this very well. He asked, "Can you imagine to one day be working for the government?" And I just gave him an answer that he understood. I said, "Yes, but not as a chemist." So we had an understanding that I'm willing to talk about intelligence work. I was pretty clear that this was not, Stasi that was looking to recruit me to watch over the population and make sure that there wouldn't be a counter-revolution or something like that. So I was interested, and he did his job. And then a week later,
but Jack, 1 second before that, how does he find you? How does it work in the intelligence?
This is very interesting. I just yesterday had an interview, chat with my best German friend, who at the age of 16 became an unofficial collaborator for the Stasi, and he claims that it was he who fingered me, and there is some merit to that. The Soviets didn't have access to files in East Germany. They couldn't just go and rummage around in files. So when they went shopping for candidates to do undercover work, who possibly would be able to even assume an identity of a different nationality, they had to go and ask the Stasi. And apparently, I was on a list of names that they then went through and started talking to people. According to retired, they're not alive anymore, but at the time when they gave interviews, retired high-level KGB officers, they literally went through several thousand candidates to eventually come up with about a dozen that they sent to the U.S. in the late 70s, early 80s. So once they had a name, at that point, I was easy to find.
And Stasi, just for those who don't know, is what? The East German Secret Police?
Yes, sir.
What does it stand for? What does Stasi stand for?
Staatssicherheitsdienst. It is literally state security service.
Okay. And they were, and I was reading, I forgot where I saw this, but I was reading that in East Germany, about a third of the population was spying on the other 2/3 of the population.
I'm not sure a third, but the overall number that I remember is about 100,000 people that were either employees or collaborators. And interestingly enough, I also had a talk with a classmate of mine, high school classmate in Germany, and the Stasi tried to recruit him to spy on his father because his father was a known Christian. These things happen. They're not just in the movies. Wow.
Okay. So they find you. And now that you know the spy game pretty well, gosh, you stay deep undercover in the United States, in the middle of New York. What did they see in you that they knew that this guy would make a great intelligence officer?
Well, they saw a lot of things. First of all, they were looking for very bright people. Secondly, they were looking for people who weren't afraid to make decisions, make up their own mind. They obviously were looking for people who were ideologically correct. Nowadays, we would call it politically correct. I was a member of the Communist Party. I was a believer in communism. At that point, that belief was unshakable. And then they were also looking for an adventurous type, somebody who's not afraid to just do really, really crazy things. And you put this all together, I fit that profile quite well. They weren't looking for tall people, by the way.
All right, good.
I almost got disqualified because I'm 6'3".
Really? Well, because you stick out too much? You don't want anyone who's...
Yes, exactly. But all these other qualities that I had, in addition, what we found out, and there was an accident really, my ability to learn another language to a point where I'm almost indistinguishable from people who were born in a country. And at that point, I was just too valuable an asset to say, the guy's too tall. They actually shared that with me, and they eventually decided, well, we send him to America. These are tall people. He'll be okay.
And if you went to Japan, it wouldn't have worked out as well for you. Okay, so you meet with KGB. They like you. You pass the interview. You get the job. And what do they tell you the job is?
Well, initially, I was supposed to go to West Germany and do some spying in West Germany, which is the easiest thing for a spy to do because same country, fundamentally same background, same language, same everything. You don't have to learn anything other than spycraft. But when it turned out that, I also, as part of my training, I had to learn another language. And as I threw myself with full force into this, and within about 6 months, I was able to read novels in the original, and I bragged about it. And that's when they said, let's see if maybe we can make him into an American.
You learned English on your own?
Initially, I had a tutor. I started from scratch, even though I had high school English, but I forgot everything. Started a couple of tutors, but from then on, it was me just reading a lot and learning the words. And by reading, you also learn the grammar rather than academically. It becomes part of how you speak. So I couldn't pass a grammar test right now, but I write well.
Okay, so after learning how to speak the language, they teach you the spycraft, and that takes about how long? So they find you at what age do they find you? Did you recruit?
They found me at the age of, let me count backwards, 21.
So they find you at 21. They train you for how many years?
I started. I was being full-time KGB at the age of 23. I came to the United States at the age of 28. So there was roughly 5 years of training in between.
Well, so the only training I ever saw about spies is what I saw in James Bond movies. So tell me what do they teach you? Like how to kill people 7 different ways with a fountain pen?
Now, the most important part of training was spycraft and operational stuff. And that starts with, and I had to learn Morse code, and shortwave reception, decryption and encryption. It was a pretty elaborate stuff. I had a code that was developed specifically only for me, but this was all manual. Nowadays, things are a little different. Counter surveillance, very important. Meetings, and I don't know if you're familiar with that term, dead drop operations, and all that, and also.
Jack, describe what a dead drop is.
Well, a dead drop is fundamentally an asynchronous handing over of material. For instance, when I needed, I traveled periodically. I traveled back behind the Iron Curtain, and for that, I always got a manufactured passport. So, in order to avoid a Russian diplomat / KGB agent meeting me and handing me this thing, he put it in an oil can and threw it someplace at a spot where I would know when to pick it up where. That's a dead drop operation.
So they're teaching this over a 5-year period, dead drop, all spycraft. You're learning a language. You're learning the nuances of a language. Because what you read in a book is not the same the way people talk. It's just...
No, that is correct. In Moscow, I had a native speaker, an American who had defected or whatever, emigrated from the United States to the Soviet Union. And I met with her twice a week for almost 2 years. And lastly, I was also introduced to 2 ex-spies. Also, they were American citizens. In the world of espionage, people who know a little bit about espionage, they're rather famous. They were Helen and Peter Cohen, atomic spies. and I met with them about once a week. So yes, I learned conversational English as well. That is, while in Germany, no way, because they didn't have a trusted individual with who I could have interaction.
But once they feel that you're ready, they pick the assignment for you, and that's to go into the United States?
That's right. Now, you're never really ready. You just, they throw you in the water and you sink or swim. I guarantee you, most of people like me sank.
Explain to me, what actually do they do? They say, okay, you get on a plane, we're going to give you, I think it was $10,000, a fake
Yes.
passport, and good luck.
Not quite. I went from Moscow to New York. It took about 3 weeks, and it was a zigzag route in order to avoid tracing me back to Moscow. I changed passports twice, once in Vienna and once in Rome. And the other thing that I had with me, the most important thing I had with me, was a certified copy of a birth certificate under the name of Jack Barsky. This is who I was to become. And as I said, it took about 3 weeks. And I met Soviet agents in 2 cities, Vienna and Rome. And that was it. But fundamentally, the moment I stepped into the departure hall in Sheremetyevo, this is the international airport in Moscow, I was on my own. There was no more, no more talking to the boss, no more reporting back. I was on my own. I had a task. The immediate task was get to New York and then acquire documentation under the name of Jack Barsky so you can become a functional American citizen.
What did your passport say, the fake passport they made?
The fake passport, that was a Canadian. I don't know why they would never tell me things that they thought I didn't need to know. So yes, the passport I entered the United States with was Canadian. It's the only passport, the phony name of which I remember, William Dyson. That's not a surprise because that's the name I entered the United States with in Chicago.
You come through Chicago with a fake passport of William Dyson.
That is correct.
And your objective now is to get enough identification as Jack Barsky.
Correct. And in those days, that was still doable. I had to start really at the bottom, and I think I don't know if the rules are still the same, but in those days in New York, to get a driver's license, you needed to have 2 pieces of 2 documents. One that showed where you live, and the other one showed where you were born, a birth certificate. I had the birth certificate. The other one at the time that was acceptable was a library card. And that was supposed to be a piece of cake, right? You go to the library and you fill in an application, you get a card. Guess what? They asked me for identification. The Russians didn't know that. So now, and this is why they picked somebody like me. I eventually found a way around this. One time I went to the Museum of Natural History and they had memberships. So I paid $50 for a membership and I got a plastic card that had my name and my address on it. With that, I could get the library card.
Wow. So they gave you cash also for living expenses?
Yes, I got one infusion of cash because for 1 year I didn't work because I didn't want to work under the table. I just worked on getting to know the city and getting the documentation. Particularly important was to get a Social Security card, and so sometime at the end of this first year, I got another $10,000 in a debt drop operation. That carried me into the point at the point when I had my first job, and that paid enough for me so that I could live on that. I didn't need extra money anymore.
So you come to this country, you come to New York City, you rent an apartment?
No. This is one of those SRO, single room occupancy hotels. Pretty. When certainly not a luxury hotel.
Yeah, New York in the late 70s was not a luxury place. It was pretty terrible.
No, and the thing is, in those places, if you had cash, you paid with cash. Nobody asked you who you were, where you came from, where you were going. So that was reasonably safe. But it didn't have an address. It did, it didn't have a, it wasn't like you. So in those, I had no job and I had no apartment. So I did not socialize, period. I couldn't have had.
So what do? You wake up in the morning, or have this SRO, you have your coffee. Now what? It's 9:01. What are you doing?
I left the hotel every morning at a certain time and then spent the rest of the day in the city. I got to know New York on foot really well. I took the subway to, every line to the very end. And sometimes I went to the movies. In those days, you could get a double feature on 42nd Street for $2. The floor was a little sticky. I'm not talking about those porn establishments. You could see some real movies. And then I came back at around 5 to give the impression that I actually had something to do.
You're building
a job.
You're building a cover.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Now, by the way, I read in the book, it was some outrageous project they gave you where you had to infiltrate the United States, get close to Jimmy Carter's Zbigniew Brzezinski, his secretary.
Yeah, that was a dream. Well, I was trained to fundamentally collect political intelligence. In other words, get close to decision makers in foreign policy, or at least influencers. And they mentioned a number of organizations, such as the Hudson Institute, which is still in existence, Columbia University, the School of International Relations, or whatever it's called, that was headed by Brzezinski, who was then also became the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter. And Brzezinski was the only name that they ever mentioned. And it wasn't a clearly defined task. They didn't say, you must get together, but it would be great if you meet somebody like that. Well, that was like a pipe dream.
So that was their wish list. That was their wish list.
Yeah, my first job was I was a bike messenger. If you're a bike messenger, you really can't get close to somebody who is the head of an institute at Columbia University. By the way, I'm now mentoring graduate students at Columbia. So eventually I made it, but it took a long time.
So during this first year, are you meeting other spies? Are you going to, you're communicating with Moscow of any progress that you're making?
Yeah, well, the communication was, I get, once a week, I got radio transmissions and, was encoded messages via shortwave. And my report back went through the snail mail with secret writing. And so, that the communication cycle was about 3 weeks. And so when I said they were looking for people who can make decisions on their own, I made a lot of decisions on my own. A lot of the advice that I got in Moscow was given to me by people who thought they knew who didn't know. I had to find out myself.
Right, like to get a library card and all these other things.
Yeah, and get your first job without having
Social Security card.
Proof that you worked someplace else. So if I found that bike messenger was the way to go. Nobody asked questions.
And one would think that the KGB should know these kind of simple things, right?
They should have, but they didn't. And this is the delusions that these were all smart people, and they had spent time in New York, but as diplomats, and so they didn't live like Americans. They interacted with Americans, but that's like going to the zoo and observing the tigers, but you don't know how to really be a tiger.
Yeah, good point. So now you're in this first year, you're building up a cover. By the way, during this period of time, this is like the mid 70s, mid 1970s or late 70s?
No, and I arrived in '78. Uh, I was done getting my documentation in 1980.
So 1980. So those 2 years, how many spies? Because I lived in New York. I was going to college. I just gone to high school at that time, and I just graduated. How many spies from the Soviet Union, KGB, were in New York at the time?
Well, you got to think that at least half the Soviet diplomats, and there were two types: the ones that worked at the United Nations, and the ones that were, in the embassy. But that was in Washington D.C. At least half of those were officially KGB, and that's as far as people like me, a lot fewer. No more than it's. I don't think it added up to double digits.
Really?
Yes, and this is verifiable. There was some information that came directly out of KGB archives that indicate that in those years, the KGB trained about 10 of us and sent 10 of us into the United States.
So you're staying in New York, and then you go in 1980, you do all your documentation, you get your job as a bike messenger, and then you go to Baruch College. Why do you go to Baruch?
Yes, I'm always a little bit inaccurate with the years, but I think it was 1982. First, I had to get a high school equivalency diploma. That took me a little time. And then and they wanted me to maybe go to Columbia, and they had no idea what the tuition was. I couldn't possibly afford this. I had to be able to cover the fact that I went to school full time and had the money to do that. So City University was the place, was the school to go to, and Baruch was at the time. I was supposed to maybe study economics, and Baruch would have been the school. And I also took a student loan. I took $10,000 out. So at that, and I still work part-time as a bike messenger. So nobody could have questioned or can't come up with the idea that I had funds coming from places other than my work.
And you're still living in this SRO?
No. As soon as I got this paying job, within a month, I disappeared from that place, and I wound up in Queens in a nice one-bedroom apartment that I could afford. I think the rent was $270 a month in those days.
And you're meeting people. You're creating. You're having a friends network of people. Is
slowly most of the people that I befriended at the time was in a natural situation with the young people in college. And a couple of professors. But, going out there and socializing in circles where I would have found people that were of direct interest wasn't that easy because, school, part-time work, still a bike messenger, limited means, no way. When I had my first job at MetLife, the job took over because I wound up in data processing, what they called this in those days, and that had a lot of night and weekend work. So I just wasn't situated to mingle, neither time-wise nor money-wise, to mingle with folks that were of interest. That happened over time, but at that time I was already done with the KGB.
Now, you're already at this point, you're ideologically in tune with communism. They pick the best and the brightest. They send you over here, and you're here for 2-3 years. You're looking at an American way of life where we had a Yankee or Met fan back in the
day. Neither, but I became a Yankee fan because my son was a Yankee fan. And when my son, who is now 30 years old, when he got in high school, he got into baseball. I really started taking an interest in baseball, and now I understand baseball better than football. I was a Knicks fan.
So you're a Knicks fan. Okay, so you're a Knicks fan. You're acclimating to New York, really an American way of life that, especially in New York City, where you have people from all over the world. There's freedom. Right. New York back then was we had Mayor Koch. He was about as vocal as a mayor could be. Very, very to the people. Used to walk around town going, "How am I doing?
Yeah. How am I doing? How am I doing?"
Right. He was a man of the people. And
I remember, but let me just put something in here because it just it popped into my head. We had a water shortage while I was a messenger, and Koch came out with this saying: "If it's mellow, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down."
Right. I remember that time.
Yeah, he was a people person.
He was a people. And tell me, the restaurants, they didn't serve water at the table unless you asked for it because we couldn't waste water. Right. So are you having like an ideological clash? What you learned in the Soviet Union, what you grew up on, 1,500 calories a day, and a lifestyle that's drab and now you come to New York City, the capital of the world. You're seeing the freedom that's here. You're seeing the opportunity that someone who just literally came here with nothing is able to make something of themselves. No one's asking you. No one's bothering you. You have freedom. Are you starting to say, wait a second, things aren't lining up the way I thought they would?
Well, see, ideology, especially if you get this from childhood on, is not that easy to shed. You start rationalizing. One of the rationalizations was that the United States was doing so well because they stole everything from the third world. So I clearly the difference in standard of living was like phenomenal, but that didn't get me off of communist ideals.
So you're still a communist. You still love the communist way of life, and it makes all the sense to you. So what you're seeing here, you're rationalizing away.
No, yes, but some of the things that we were taught just didn't pan out. So when I started working for a mutual insurance company, and in those days, insurance companies, banks, and the military-industrial complex were like the evil representatives of capitalism.
Right.
So I'm starting to work for MetLife, and I couldn't find any evil people in my immediate environment. They paid me well. They fed me lunch. This was 1 Madison Avenue where 10,000 people worked there.
Yeah.
They couldn't have them go out for lunch, so you got free lunch, and the people were nice. It felt almost like East Germany. So I knew that, not everything I was taught was correct. So I slowly moved, from way left towards the center, politically speaking. When I voted, I voted illegally twice. I voted Democrat.
You voted for Carter in 1980.
I certainly did.
Yeah. All right. That's just something about the Democratic Party, huh? That a KGB guy feels okay with
overturned.
that. Wow. All right. Great. All right. So you're doing this now, and now you go to Baruch. What are you majoring in Baruch? You go to Baruch for what?
Well, I was supposed to, this is what the KGB folks told me, study economics and then get a job on Wall Street. Wow. Well, not a bad idea. So I enrolled with the intent to get an economics degree. And then I had to take one computer course. And I said, oh my God, this is awesome. I love it. And without even checking with my handlers, I just changed my major and I got into computers. And interestingly enough, when I told him back in Moscow, when I went back for my debriefing every 2 years, I told him that, I'm about to graduate with a degree in computer systems. They thought it was a good idea. And it was an easy way to get a job and an easy way to rather quickly make a significant amount of money. So they let it go. I wasn't reprimanded for that. And I loved it. I mean, this was great. I finally could use my brain again, and play with a computer. Deep down inside, I'm a nerd, and this was probably the best job I've ever had, was computer programming. And at that point, I don't know exactly when that happened. There was a pivot point when the spying got in the way of my real job. And this is, I believe, something that the Russians were aware of, because, if you're really successful establishing an identity in another country that is not your true self, but eventually it becomes your true self, and that's when your asset in the other country, if you're the KGB, your asset is in danger of doing things you don't want them to do.
So you graduate Baruch, you get a job, life is great, and all this time you're supplying the KGB with information about the country. What are you telling them? What information that, looking back, was, looking back 40 years later, I don't know how much information, what it meant, but during the day, what was like pivotal information you were passing along?
Okay, so two things that I think they considered of value, other than the fact that I was actually there. And that part of my value I was never really told, but in hindsight, I know that because there were times during the Cold War that when the Soviet Union and the United States got very close to kicking out their diplomats from the other country. And then the only ones left behind enemy lines, so to speak, would have been the illegals like me. So the other two things of value here were, first of all, I was to periodically send them information how Americans react to certain things that happened around the world. Things like shooting down the Korean airliner, like or how the Americans, how they might vote, this kind of stuff. They got these reports, a lot of them from the diplomats, but they read the New York Times and then copied that. And the other thing is, I was supposed to act as a talent scout, meet people, particularly in college, and because college students eventually could wind up in positions, either in industry or in the government, of value. So meet them, describe them, profile them, and send that information to the center.
Did you recruit people? Did you recruit people while you were here?
I know this is not how it works. When it comes to recruiting and running an agent, there's always three individuals involved, at least within the KGB. The first one who spots the talent, the second one who recruits the talent, and the third one who runs the talent. They don't know about each other. And as a spotter, I was never told what they did with the information, because this is the rules of conspiracy. By the way, I gotta throw that into the mix here, because it's really delicious. I graduated from Baruch as valedictorian. And that was most likely the only time that a Russian agent gave the valedictory at an American business school.
Business school, talking about the virtues of capitalism. Amazing world we live in, eh?
So, yeah, and you know what? The speech was about 5 minutes long, and I talked about, and it sounds almost like left-wing Democrat ideology. I talked about developing capitalism with a human face, right? Naja. I just said something in German, naja. Anyway, so I just wanted to throw that in because it's pretty bizarre.
And how long are you doing this before trouble starts, before you realize that the FBI might be onto you?
Okay, so I didn't realize it. They thought I was in my 10th year. I already was. I had passed my 10-year anniversary, which was Columbus Day, 1988. And in December, the Soviets, the KGB, warned me that it was a very strong warning. It was an emergency, a graphic emergency signal that had only one interpretation: get out of the country. And my escape route was planned to go to Canada, and then I would be exfiltrated out of Canada back into the other side of the Iron Curtain. And I didn't go because something else that the KGB didn't know was the fact that I had an 18-month-old daughter in this country. And I really, really struggled with, I wanted to take care of her. I loved this girl. I mean, this is the first time that I had an attack of unconditional love. I mean, just like, this is the kind of love that I would give her everything, and what I got back was a smile, right? So I ignored that sign, and I intensified my counter surveillance measures. I tried to figure out, was I really in danger? And I determined I wasn't. And I was pretty sure that I was right because my training was so good. But they were insistent, and eventually it's the only time that they actually sent somebody to very briefly speak to me. And that was on a subway platform of the A train at 80th and Hudson in Queens, where he came up to me and whispered into my ears, "You got to come home or else you're dead." So I knew now I had to make a decision. I either go or I stay. And if I stay, I have to tell him a story why I stayed. And I didn't want to defect. I still had that residual loyalty to my country, East Germany, which was still allied with the Soviet Union. And I don't know. Nowadays, I'm thinking it may have been the Holy Spirit, because I came up with this phenomenal lie, which I told him in a letter in secret writing. It says, I can't come back. I have AIDS, HIV AIDS. Death sentence in those days. And certainly they didn't want to have somebody with that kind of a disease in their country. And it worked. Now, I didn't know that it was going to work, because they could have determined, the guy is lying and now we're going to go after him. I knew that was a possibility. And so for about 3 months, I lived in fear.
When they said that you'd be dead, who would kill you? They would? The KGB
No,
or the CIA?
See, you can interpret this one way or the other. You can take it as straight. It was spoken by a Russian with an accent. You know what dead means. You're dead. Your cover is blown. You can say you're dead. It's not the word I would use in a situation like that, but it can be interpreted that way. Or, we're going to kill you. And I knew of a couple of cases that were out in public where the KGB went after defectors. Betrayal of the motherland was to be punished by death.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, the saving grace was that I wasn't a Soviet citizen. I was a contract worker as a German. All of this you puzzle together. In hindsight, you figure it out later. But at the time, as I said, for about 3 months, I lived in fear. And for instance, I made sure that I was not predictably at a certain place at a certain time. So I changed the way I went to work. I changed the time, and on and on and on. And I also made sure that, really the FBI wasn't really chasing me. And I was right. So after 3 months, I thought, I was pretty much, I was pretty much in the clear. And I was married to this girl, Chelsea, for whom I stayed. And at that point, I said to her, okay, why don't we go see if we can buy a house? That was the decision point where officially I knew that I would live the rest of my life as an American citizen without necessarily ever having to talk with the FBI or being discovered.
And so you're still playing this game, and no one is onto you, really. You keep this up until, what, a couple of more years later before your cover is blown? Or another 10 years?
Well, the cover was blown fundamentally by somebody who betrayed his ex-organization. It was a fellow who, by the name of Vasily Mitrokhin, he was a senior KGB employee who worked in the archives, and they had piles and piles, like rooms full of files. And he had he had an early epiphany that system was terrible, because he could read some of the stuff, and the internal stuff, the gulag and all that. So he said, the only thing I can do is like collect information. And he would take snippets of paper that he written on by hand out day after day, year after year. And after so many years, he decided to offer this to, initially he offered it to the CIA, who said, no, thank you, because they didn't have a clue. The person who he spoke with was a junior employee at the embassy. And then he wound up with at MI6, British intelligence, and they opened him, they received him with open arms, and got him to England. And eventually some of that information was shared with the FBI. And amongst the notes there was just a name, Jack Barsky, designation, illegal, living somewhere in the Northeast. And that's how the FBI found me. If I had taken on a name like John Smith or something like that, they wouldn't have found me. And all this, when you put it all together, all these quote unquote accidents allowed me to be able to speak to you now, allowed me to eventually go back to Germany, allowed me to take the two. I had developed a split personality pretty much to merge these two personalities and, live out reasonably happy and reasonably sane, to the extent you can be reasonably happy with that kind of a background, or sane. But that's the rest of the story. The FBI then introduced themselves, and obviously, to me, once I found out that they want information in exchange for my freedom, I was relieved, to put it mildly.
So this was what, 1997, 98 or so?
Yeah, in that neighborhood. I believe it was 1997.
So you're never incarcerated? You're never prosecuted?
No,
nothing? Zero?
No, I was detained for 2 hours the first time we met, quote unquote. When they introduced themselves, they took me to a motel and talked with me for a couple of hours. When I made it clear that I would be 100% cooperative, I think I made a pretty good impression. But they weren't sure at the time. They let me go home after those 2 hours, but they had a large contingent of folks in the area, just in case I were to try to run.
So you're in this country for close to 20 years, deep undercover, giving the Soviets the information that they need.
Yes.
Right? And passing yourself off as not only a good American, but valedictorian of Baruch, a responsible guy, a father, a husband, a businessman, making money, seeing it,
yeah,
and right under the noses of the FBI.
Yep. Here's another tidbit. That's something that's not in the book because it happened after the book was finished. I'm now friends with a retired FBI agent whose task at one point he was moved to New York, where he was supposed to look for people like me. Didn't find any, but he found me in Atlanta, Georgia, many years later. People like us were fundamentally not findable unless somebody pointed to, me with a name.
So wait, Jack, if this agent didn't turn over information to MI6, you could have still been operating.
That is true. I had stopped, but there's always a possibility that, and I cannot say how I would have reacted. Let's say if a Russian national, so like working for Russian intelligence, were to come to me and offer me a lot of money for stuff that I had access to. Right. I honestly, depending upon, it's so easy to say, you know what? Nah, I wouldn't have done it. I'm not, this is not right, because you can't. If somebody says, here's $1 million and all we need is the the schematic of the New York State electric grid. I don't know.
Right.
Now I wouldn't do it anymore.
But
it
now
depends upon the time.
You became an American citizen. You're a full patriotic American citizen living in the United States. And 2014, I believe you became a citizen?
Correct.
So you've been a citizen of this country, never prosecuted. I believe you also work with or aid the NSA and the FBI on espionage tactics of the KGB?
Right.
So with your background of all this, of espionage and the world of espionage, who would you say the top spy agency in the world today is?
Okay, one of them doesn't exist anymore, but let me give you three, and none of them are U.S. or Russia. The Mossad,
Israel,
Cuban intelligence, and the Stasi.
So Mossad, and who's the second?
The Cuban intelligence.
Oh, Cuba.
I forgot what they were called. And you know, the Mossad is obvious because Israel has been for Israel since the state of Israel came into existence. They were fighting for their survival, real survival, not just like something is coming up 10 years from now. The Mossad is like absolutely excellent. The Cubans had it easy because of so the diaspora, so many Cubans moving to Miami. So it was very easy to introduce agents into the United States. And the East Germans had the Stasi that had an easy time operating in West Germany. So really the Mossad, to me, is the one that deserves the gold medal.
So it's now close to 40 years later. If you're giving this speech now at Baruch, valedictorian, you're speaking to a lot of millennials who believe communism, socialism, communism, alternative government, socialism, alternative form of economic rule, or just a different way of life. Living the life you've lived, learning what you've learned, becoming an American citizen from East Germany, what would you be telling them? What would be your message today?
Well, this is the kind of speech that I'm still hoping to be able to give one day. I have it already written out in several essays. First of all, I would start with what I got to know pretty well is the American Constitution, which is, in my view, the best, most elegant, most the best document ever written about how to run a society, run a country. And when we're talking about the opposite is, the opposite to me is collectivism, based opposing a democratic republic that we supposedly still have. It's collectivism, and collectivism. It's already starting in this country. The left is highly collectivist. It takes a village, right? That book that supposedly Hillary Clinton wrote. Collectivism then typically it moves towards socialism and communism, and it hasn't ever worked in history. And this is inbuilt into the communist ideology. The basic tenet that was written down or expressed by Karl Marx is from each to their capabilities, to each according to their needs. Now, who determines what you're capable of and what I need? So now you need somebody who is the determinant. And so and that eventually becomes the party, and the party is hierarchical, and before you know it, everything becomes a dictatorship. And in history, every revolutionary movement that succeeded eventually wound up in a dictatorship, period. No change. And the funny thing is, that it's not funny, but the folks that the initial revolutionaries very often become victims of their own revolution. And what you see right now, when you look at what's happening with Black Lives Matter, that was supposed to be a grassroots movement, and they're building a hierarchy. Isn't that interesting?
This is George Orwell's Animal Farm, right? Everyone's equal, and
Yes,
the pigs
sir.
are equal. And I think it was
Yes.
Rousseau who said that every revolution starts to consume its own. And
Yes, it does.
that we're seeing that. And boy, I hope you write that. I hope you deliver that essay. I hope it's in print one day. I know a lot of Americans could learn from what your life experience and what you've seen, and basically shed light on what I think is just a misguided way. They're just misguided, and they just don't get what's going on. They don't see the bigger picture. Jack, I want to tell you, man, this book, if you didn't read this already, it's go out and get this. Deep Undercover, how Jack Barsky was deep undercover in the United States, in New York, my city, for 20 years, and hardly anyone knew. I think nobody knew, right? It was just your handler. Until you got called out. You were so good, you could have been spying for the next 20 years and no one would have found you.
Yes, and thank God the ending is what the ending became as it's laid out in the book.
Jack, all I could say is I'm glad you're on our side, and I'm so happy that you're an American citizen. You're going to live out your life here, and you have a beautiful family, and you could spread that message of what a great country we have. And I don't think anyone better than a former KGB agent could tell that story.
I'm still working on it, sir.
Great. Jack, I want to thank you so much. I greatly appreciate the time you spent and just what I've learned from you. And I wish you continued success, and God bless you and your family.
God bless you too, sir.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.